welcome back to another episode of the Daily Flip podcast. I'm your host, Alex, and today we're going to be flipping through two stories, obviously starting with the terror attack in New Orleans, what we know, what we don't know, what the investigation may glean, and then also an article talking about the failure of the Democratic Party and Kamala Harris as a candidate. So following up on earlier this week's episode about Joe Biden and his failure. And of course, we will end today with our daily delight, a story meant to leave you feeling positive, ready to take on the day. Now, that's enough rambling for me. Let's jump in to our daily debate. So, should we have more coordination between local and federal agencies on protecting public sites during this holiday season? That is one of the things that is actually mentioned here within the first article, that there was a specific memo put out by the FBI about the potential for certain attacks to happen during this holiday time, and some areas heeded those warnings, some areas did not. Now, they're not saying that's a direct reason that this attack was able to happen, but it is a question that we always have to keep in mind, especially after we saw a similar style attack in Germany as well. How much coordination should there be between these different agencies? Should there be oversight? Should they be able to say that, have spot checks essentially? But these are questions that will definitely be ruminated on and talked about for probably the next few weeks as we come away from this terrible, terrible tragedy. So, our first article today comes from MSNBC. Headline reads, "The New Orleans truck attack is an urgent national warning." And this is talking about on two layers. On the surface layer, you can most definitely understand the idea of this being a national security issue. This is being a national problem that we all have to deal with, given the fact that it is designated as a terrorist attack, and the sympathies of the man who committed it seem to be towards radical Islam. That's because he has an ISIS flag in the back. He had an ISIS flag in the back of the car. Now, of course, everything could just be appearances that we don't necessarily know. Maybe he was forced to do this. We will continue on this road. I'm not trying to take away agency from this man. I'm not trying to say he didn't commit these acts, but to ascribe his reasoning until we either have some sort of letter that he wrote, maybe a manifesto, or he professes it. The point being, on social media, anywhere, if he professed it there, we have to always be skeptical. Now, it looks pretty clean cut, and I would hesitate to say that there is much else that could really change people's minds. Most people have already gone forward with the narrative, which is fair enough. So that's aspect number one, the possibility of duplicate attacks, of copycat attacks, of people who have a similar ideology or simply want to impart a terrifying blow, impart terror to any segment of the population within the United States that may have a different ideology than the United States itself. But the second layer here is the fact that, as I mentioned, MSNBC brings up that the FBI has sent out a memo and that this was something that was brought to people's attention. Now, does that mean that they had evidence that said this was going to happen? These were plots that were no. But the idea that we are going into a holiday season when people like to be around, be outside. I mean, Bourbon Street in New Orleans on New Year's, of course, it's going to be a packed venue. And the fact that those sort of situations are not fully locked down, that those places with mainly foot traffic are not fully barricaded and blockaded, that speaks to some sort of failure. Because, of course, if you want to have a mass casualty event, those are obvious targets. That should be one of the first things that comes to mind. Honestly, the memo from the FBI shouldn't be necessary, but they sent it out, which is just an extra layer on top of the fact that it's common sense. And that is why when you see municipalities, some of the biggest ones being New Orleans, it's a big tourist city. A lot of people probably go in there for New Year's. The fact that it slips through there, it raises questions about where else something like this could happen. So I'll read the first paragraph of the article. Quote, "Early on New Year's Day, police say a 42-year-old Army veteran drove a rented truck flying a black ISIS flag into a crowd of New Orleans revelers, killing at least 15 and injuring more than 30. The attack, which the FBI is investigating as an act of terrorism, comes on the heels of a similar attack at the Christmas market in Magdeburg, Germany, that killed 5 and injured dozens. And it follows an FBI warning to law enforcement on December 6th to prepare for low-tech vehicle ramming attacks at outdoor crowds during the holiday season. And this is, we're going to end the quote there, but this just, it baffles the mind that we are at a point where this sort of low-tech attack is, one, the best option, it seems, the most efficient option. The fact that we've had enough restrictions put in place. And let me be clear, there's always holes. There are always going to be things that we can't necessarily account for. And maybe it comes down to budget or feasibility about getting certain materials there. But the fact that we have locked down so many different avenues, whether it be the creation of bombs because we are actively tracking the materials that would be needed for it, or because that would take a lot of coordination across a cell and possibly we're watching multiple people within that cell, which then increases the likelihood that we would be able to catch them. Whatever these different restrictions may be, they seem to be effective enough to scare away the population of terror-inducing individuals who want to affect the American public. And yet, this low-tech option, the one, I'm not saying it's going to be the easiest thing in the world in order to shut it down, but versus hours upon hours of surveillance and monitoring and algorithms that check everything, we put up barriers. We put up permanent installments, or even not even permanent installments. You know what a lot of different country roads do, and when they want to lock down and make sure people don't drive on them, paths in country towns, or even in places like Frankfort, Kentucky, they have a few different areas where they have removable steel pipes. You have a hole in the ground, and then you can put the steel pipe down there if you don't want cars to drive on it, and you can remove it if you want to be able to gain access to those areas. You put a padlock on it, so then service technicians can still get into the park and make sure everything's okay, but then when they're done, they can put the steel pipe back in. These sort of things, while not necessarily low cost, they are one-time measures that can possibly have a major impact on something like this. Imagine if Bourbon Street, from one intersection to the other, from the left-hand side of Bourbon Street to the right-hand side of Bourbon Street, had 3 or 4 of these steel pipes in there. No car can pass. They're not going to be able to remove the lock unless they have a saw or a torch, which is going to be hard in a crowded public area. So these sort of small improvements in infrastructure alone, but also for traffic control, you can use them to actually regulate where people are able to go on non-busy days. The fact that these simple measures are the ones that are being overlooked are frustrating. That is not to say, like I said earlier, it's not to say that our other systems are perfect, that we're able to monitor everything. It could truly be a cost and shock value sort of scenario, which is a common everyday thing that we all use and we all rely on, can be used as a weapon against us. I can understand how that would have a certain shock value, and it would instill fear beyond necessarily a potential mass casualty event caused by a chemical weapon or something to that effect. But the fact that we haven't at least made it almost impossible to do without banning cars and just locking off certain pedestrian and and high traffic areas, that is frustrating. I think there's if we're going to do a broader analysis of the American infrastructure system, because you can make an argument that this is actually down to how we design our cities and the layouts of everything like that, which is fair enough. We could adopt the Spanish model. There are a few cities in Spain where they actually cordon off basically a little 3-block or a 3x3 block square, and then you can only drive around the outside of that. On the inside of that, it's all walking space. It's basically shut off to anybody that's not a resident, And that sort of thing can make sense to me. I feel as though that's a way to actually lock down certain areas, make sure that they are pedestrian. Only pedestrians don't have to fear walking out there in normal circumstances, not even during a terrible circumstance like this that happened in New Orleans. And then also, you can regulate the flow of traffic and keep them out of those areas where kids may be playing. And you can have these sort of systems where you have enclosed communities, possibly self-sufficient blocks, 3 block spheres that have all the shops they would need. Now, whether or not that's actually good, I don't think you should just stay within your 3 block area. The point being that there are systems out there that enable you to deal with potential threats like this that also have practical effects. And we have to really take this into consideration as we continue to build in the United States. Are we building any unique new towns now? Not necessarily. They're kind of cropping out of old towns or nearby towns. One of the towns near my house is a very great example where it used to be a little nothing town with a shopping center or something, and now it's huge developments. The roads kind of don't make sense, but that is better than just straight lines that can get ultra crowded. The point being that we are going to be expanding, hopefully moving into the future. We'll have a larger population. There's ideas of building new cities. I mean, lots of different entrepreneurs have thrown ideas around, and maybe we should have more well thought out designs moving forward so we can start to limit these sort of possibilities and make sure that these vehicles that we so heavily rely on are not turned into weapons against us. And we need to, if anything, spend money. And I know government spending is always a problem, but I'm pretty sure after an incident like this, you could most definitely convince people, at least on a local, state, or city, municipal level, that this sort of spending needs to be done to secure these places where we all go in order to enjoy our time with our family, with our friends, to enjoy our hometowns, our main streets. I think these are serious considerations that have to be brought up, and they always are, and very little is ever done. But hopefully, this will be a case of change, not a case of stagnation and complacency. All right, with that, let's move on to our second article. This one comes from dailywire.com. The headline reads, "Here's how badly Kamala performed on election night." So through the beginning of this week, we talked about Joe Biden. We made it a pretty short one just so that coming into the new year, we could talk about his legacy, given that it was the year in which he will no longer be president, that his party lost the election, and it was confirmed that he will no longer be president of the United States. Now we're going to go to the flip side of that equation. We talked about his presidency itself and his campaign. Now we're going to talk about the campaign that guaranteed that his legacy will be cemented exactly as it was. If Kamala Harris won, the legacy of Joe Biden would have gone on to been a man who stepped down at the right time, a man who saw that there was a next leader for the party. There was a generational change that could happen here. That is why he put her on the ticket in the first place, in order to usher in a new era of the Democratic Party, and he saw her potential, and that's why he stepped aside. Or that's what his legacy would have been. That would have been the mythology, whether it's true or not. That is the story that would be crafted. Now, we, like I said, have a story, she lost, that is possibly two battling narratives. There's one that the Biden camp and some traditional Democrats are trying to say Kamala couldn't have won in the first place. She did a terrible campaign, so on and so forth. The more mainstream, the more central to the Democratic identity right now is the fact that it was Joe Biden's fault. That Joe Biden was the one that didn't step down in time. That Joe Biden wasn't able to actually live up to the expectations he set when he said he was going to beat Donald Trump. So now we really want to, or I want to understand why. What actually happened on the night of that put this into motion, and possibly ask the question as to where she could have done better. Because though I am not a Kamala voter, or a hesitant Kamala voter, or anywhere adjacent to a Kamala voter, I was never going to vote for her in the first place. I didn't like most of her policies. The point that I'm getting at there is, though I'm nowhere close to Kamala, and therefore had she could have done this better, I'm voting for her, but I'm hesitant on this because I rejected a lot of her policies wholesale, especially the corporate gouging stuff. But my point is that maybe we can still glean something based on the trends here, because these are pretty historic trends. We've had enough time to really analyze what was going on in all of these different counties. We have a lot of the raw vote totals stuff in now, so we have a better picture of what was happening on election night. Quote, Harris lost in multiple areas that haven't voted for a Republican presidential candidate in more than a century. Trump eked out a win in Fall River, Massachusetts, which hasn't voted for a GOP presidential candidate in 100 years. Calvin Coolidge, who was from Massachusetts, was the last Republican to win Fall River in 1924. And this is something that I actually love to talk about with Massachusetts, and I have a friend who's up there, and he always talks about how on a national scale, Massachusetts Republicans are probably more akin to moderate or center voters and maybe moderate or a little bit center-leaning Democrats. So on the local level, they'll very often vote for R, or at least there's a strong enough presence that they're able to continue to exist there as a party. And yet on the national level, they're more likely to vote D. So this is, while it's not a huge windfall, it is always important when you see these historic moments of 100 plus years when things flip. Now, I'll be very interested to see if this trend continues. Without Donald Trump on the ticket next time, possible. Well, he may actually be as a vice president. Who knows? We'll see if his ego could be satiated that much and they'd be willing to have him there. But the point being that when these sort of movements happen, whether they're historic in 100 years or even 50 years, 20 years, because there's been lots of calcification of the existing system and some of the changes that have been happening. You know, Ohio is a hard red state at this point, even though 20 years ago it would have been considered flip, maybe blue. The point is that I would love to see after Trump's time if that is actual calcification or it is simply swaying away from Biden and Harris or swaying towards the man himself. It probably is a combination of the two. And given the fact that this is not one of the other examples. So this is in a Massachusetts majority white state, majority upper middle to upper class. There are of course working class people there, but there tends to be a higher standard of living, a little bit more money flowing around in Massachusetts. So the idea that this is from a swing in minority voters, which Trump experienced across the entire nation, that this is a swing in women voters who are college educated, those actually voted a little bit more in favor of Kamala Harris. So the fact that all the other movements, all the other changes don't necessarily explain this one, in my opinion. The fact that he won this in Massachusetts speaks to the fact that either Joe Biden was that terrible and Kamala was taking up his legacy and was that bad, or that Trump in general spoke to a populace that felt disenfranchised, that felt like they were struggling, even in one of the most well-off states. Now, is it the richest state in the union? No, I believe it's in the top 15 list, if I'm not absolutely crazy, for per capita earnings or income. But that it speaks to the fact that he has a special message, and he had a very penetrating message. And like I said, fascinating and interesting to see where the party goes after the era of Donald Trump. He has shaped it for a long, long while, but I don't know if it will be able to survive in its same fashion, because the Tea Partiers, they probably won't be able to gain control of the classical Republicans, and I don't see it happening. So we'll see where this is taken for sure, and maybe they can even codify this change in Massachusetts moving into the future, but probably not. Now, here's one of the other big changes that actually falls in line with one of the trends that we were talking about earlier, especially when it comes to Hispanics or Latinos, having a higher turnout for Donald Trump. So this is Starr County, Texas. Quote, it hasn't voted for a Republican presidential candidate since 1892. Starr County is also the most Hispanic county in the country. And then they tweet a tweet from Ryan James Grzinski, and it says, quote, Hispanic county, the most Hispanic county in America at 97%. By 16 points. So he won that by 16 points. That is a true edification, proof point of the shift within the populations within the United States. And when I say populations, I mean the different race populations. So we know for a long time that the Hispanic population has been leaning Trump, heard the sympathies in Trump, though they've been hesitant before, whether that's because of things he's said, whether that's because they like voting for Democrats and they know that those people have actually talked to them directly as a populist before, whether it be because they didn't necessarily see the economic benefits that he brought. Maybe it's because they came from a country where they didn't deal with socialism or any sort of left-wing movement. There's lots of different reasons that he could continue to vote in that same line. Or maybe their family came from a place that was part of the Pink Revolution and they actually kind of like some of the socialist ideas. That's why they vote Democrat. Whatever it may be, those reasonings have fallen away. I'm not going to say it's just about the economy now, because that's not fair, that's not accurate, and that would be a gross generalization. But you cannot deny that Trump touted his economy, that underneath Donald Trump the first time his economy was better, whether that's a consequence of the rebuilding of Obama and then Trump's easing of regulation after the strictures of the Obama era had brought the Fed back into a prominent position to actually control the. My point being, you could attribute it to anything, but whatever you attribute to doesn't really matter, because on a emotional level alone, on a pathos level alone, times were better underneath Donald Trump. Does that mean that he ushered it in himself? Not necessarily. But the point being that resonates with people. That is definitely, I would say, 55% of most people's rationale for it. Maybe a solid 25% is, hey, he's a tough guy. I like how he stands up to people. And there's lots of different reasons, or he's a businessman. There are lots of different reasons people vote for him, but I would say if there's any guarantee, at least 50% of most people's rationale is the economy was better, if not more than that, and then there's an amalgamation of different statistics below there. That would be a fun little poll, basically a ranked choice characteristics of Trump poll, and then you could actually break it down by people. You could break it down by what people actually care about the most and have a percentage breakdown for the most part. That would actually be great. I would love to see one of those polls out here, because a lot of people, they don't like a lot of the stuff he does, including myself, and yet he's able to capture something in the common imagination and really exploit that in order to benefit him politically. So the other major one I want to point out here is Bucks County, Pennsylvania. So this was actually on the night of, and let's be clear, I remember the how tight it was. Not really that tight, but how 2020 we had talked about Bucks County a lot. So I remembered on the night of the election this conversation. And when Bucks County the returns were looking more Trump than before, and CNN mentioned the fact that this hasn't been flipped for a very, very long time. In 1988, it's not super duper long, but it is nearly 30 years. I mean, there could be current parents right now, so people who have kids who live in Bucks County, who have never seen it go red until this election. I mean, honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if there are multiple there. But the point I'm getting at is, on the night of, when it flipped and CNN was mentioning this, I said, oh yes, I remember the controversy about this. I think Trump actually has Pennsylvania on lock. And it was basically decided within the next hour and a half, I believe, from when the first rumblings of Bucks County going red were mentioned there by panicked anchors on the CNN and MSNBC. So the point that we're getting across here is that Trump has been able to break down barriers that have been constructed across the races in America, that he has been able to break down the barriers across traditional leanings in different states like Massachusetts, and he's been able to flip working class counties, or working class and a little bit middle class counties like Bucks County. He has been able to sweep. He has been able to one up the Democratic Party in all these places where they felt very secure. And question becomes from there: is it the fault of Kamala Harris? Was she not a strong enough candidate? Was she incapable of leading this party to a win in 2024? Or is it the fault of Joe Biden, who didn't give her enough time on the campaign trail in order to actually get her message out there, to redefine herself, not simply as a vice presidential candidate, not as a primary candidate, but as a presidential candidate who had already gone through and been nominated by her party? These are questions that will be flowing around forever, and an honest person will actually analyze both. Obviously, as I mentioned earlier, there are strands / branches of the Democratic Party that want to define it one way or another, set the narrative, possibly put her on the ticket in the future, relegate Biden to the history bin, when the dustbin of history is the way that would go, but we'll just say the history bin, because they thought that he was a man who was a placeholder, who could defeat Trump at the time, but knew that he was only going to be the springboard for someone else in the next generation. And I mean, Democrats and progressives even say this to this day, that he was meant to be a transition candidate. He even used that sort of language himself. And while I think that is fair enough, that he did use language that at least hints at that, it was also completely and utterly naive to believe that a man who has been striving for the presidency for this long was not going to attempt to stay. And in doing so may actually bring down your party, because though before his presidency, I would have said he's arrogant. I don't know if he's that arrogant. After his presidency, the signs were always there. He was most definitely that arrogant of a man in order to put his entire party to the side and say, no, it is my time. It is down to what I want, what I see fit is a Joe Biden presidency that lasts 8 years. And if the party comes down with me, then the party is going to come on down with me. Kamala Harris was never the best candidate. She never would have been. She was the only option once Joe Biden stepped down, though. You could have had an open convention. It would have been absolute chaos. It would not have looked good, especially because the Democrats have been able to define the House Republicans in general, as the party of chaos after the McCarthy incident, after the Mike Johnson incident, having to change the rules so it's not actually just one person that can vote or have a vote of no confidence against you. So these sort of issues, the Democrats were able to exploit very well. They were able to use and craft a narrative of the Republicans being the party of chaos. So to have an open convention, in hindsight, at the time, I thought they may do it, but in hindsight, it would not be the proper move. It would be defining yourself as the party of chaos, and Trump, basically showing Trump as the candidate of stability. And that was not an image that they could take. So in hindsight, Kamala Harris is the only option when it comes down to basically a continuation of the Biden administration, a rightful secession. And, well, they ended up really being bit in the butt for that. This is why you do not pick your candidates for any office given off of characteristics. Now, I know that if you're to physical characteristics or immutable characteristics, now you may say, well, he chose the best candidate out of the people that he's restricted with these mutable characteristics, and that is fair enough. But when you restrict by immutable characteristics, you're leaving out a pool of people who could actually be more qualified than that person. And the inverse is true. When you actually limit by immutable characteristics, there's always the possibility that that's not the case, that you do have the very best candidate. But would you really want to do that? I think this is a great example. This is a great example of why you do not do that. You never limit yourself to any given characteristic. You worry about the ability to win. And I think Joe Biden had that on his mind when picking Kamala Harris and knowing that she would probably be the next candidate for president, as he had attempted to do, or he tried to do after 2020, because obviously his son, passed away in 2015, so he couldn't go into the 2016 election, but Hillary tried to bounce from Secretary of State into the presidency. So there was no doubt that Kamala would at least be on that stage, or whoever he chose as vice president would be on that stage. And obviously she had some qualifications, but this is why we have to dispense with this. Let's worry about their characteristics. Let's try to get them in. No, you want the best person. This is the perfect example. This is irony biting the Democratic Party in the butt for letting that happen. You know who I think actually would have been a effective campaigner And let's be clear, not necessarily saying they would have been able to win. You know who I think would have been an effective campaigner? Elizabeth Warren. I feel like she can capture that Bernie energy while also appealing to the moderate crowd. She has enough name ID. Then again, having an octogenarian and a septuagenarian, I'm pretty sure she's in her 70s now. She could be, I don't know, is it sesquicentenarian for 60? But the point being that I think she could have been a good vice presidential candidate because she could have brought something economically to the table in that administration. But Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders were already doing some coordination along with AOC, so having her directly in that White House could have worked out. And then having her on the stump if this situation happened, which realistically we should have figured it was because he was having flubs back in 2020, then I think she could actually be on the stump. She could be an effective candidate, and enough people know her from her career that she could have possibly won. But hey, I wouldn't have voted for her either way because that brand of market control is not my speed. But that doesn't mean that it would have been a bad decision. Just because I wouldn't vote for it doesn't mean that on a political level, on a practical level, it wouldn't have been a bad decision or that it would have been a good decision either. But I think that probably would have been the world in which the Democrats actually had a chance. But on top of a few other people, maybe Bernie Sanders, but they needed a woman in the vice presidency. So if we're going with the woman, if we're going to say they can only dispense with one thing and they can't dispense with the other thing, then I think that or maybe Miss Jill Stein, but probably Miss Elizabeth Warren would have been a good candidate to have on there. But that's enough. We've talked about their legacy. We talked about Joe Biden and his legacy after this. And we know now that Kamala was not the next page in the Democratic Party. She may be in the future, but the turning of the page right now was Reconstruction was a slow and brutal introspection that is actually more like a surface level look at the top and saying, no, it was not our fault. It's that person's fault. It's Trump's fault. He did this, and this. Because, in politics, you can never admit you're wrong. If you admit you're wrong, then you'll probably lose your job. Isn't the political consulting class just phenomenal? So, with that said, let's jump into our daily delight. We've been talking about some very serious topics at the beginning, some very, I don't want to say heavy, but less than fun, downtrodden, the death of the Democratic Party or the change in the American democracy, and those can be pretty serious topics as well. So let's jump into our article that comes from Animals Around the Globe. Labrador going scuba diving causes internet uproar. And yes, you heard that right. There is a dog with a proper scuba helmet on. He is underwater. He is vibing. He is chilling like Bob Dylan. His owner's there. And if you want to see the photos or the videos or read any of the other two articles, all the links will be in the description below that like and subscribe button. Also down there, you can find the podcast on Spotify, Pocket Cast, Podvine, as well as the Twitter handle at Your Daily Flip, where the Twitter tirade will be resuming here very shortly as we come into the new year. And if you come back here to the YouTube channel or the RSS feed on Tuesday and Thursday, we release 6 and 6, which is 6 stories from around the world, and we cover them in 6 minutes or less. So it's a quick way to be informed about some of the different goings on, one on each continent, essentially. So with all that said, there's only one more thing to say. Stay safe. Don't die.